Okay, class, this week you have the Terminator that's going to teach you about soil aeration. So there are many factors that we're going to discuss related to soil water that have an equal bearing for this week's discussion about aeration. And so the last couple weeks we discussed soil water and pore space, porosity, and water drainage, water movement in the soil. If you think about those factors, a lot of those factors are the same that have to do with aeration, pore space, porosity. How much water is in the soil has a big effect of how much oxygen can get into the soil and how much CO2 can leave the soil. And so just keep that in mind as I talk here a little bit. Plants' roots need well aerated soil to carry out respiration. So we're here in my garden. We're transitioning between summer crops. I got corn here to my right. I got cucumbers. I got melons that are fading out in the background. And I'm coming in with some new arugula and cabbage and lettuces, carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, some fall green onions, etc. And so we're kind of in a transition time, but aeration is definitely important, and I'll tell you a little bit how I achieved that in my specific garden. Okay, so when you guys did your soils labs, you looked at and measured pore space. If your soil had very low porosity, it was wet more than 80% of the time, that means it's not filled with air. If it's 80% filled with water or more, the soil is going to be poor soil for growing. And so the other thing that could happen if your soil is very compact, your soils will have problems with O2 and gas exchange. And so as O2, oxygen, tries to get into the soil, it's moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. And so from the soil, the CO2 is leaving the soil and moving into the air. So you need a loose and aerated soil to help that to occur. Tillage is a good thing that can initially bring in lots of O2. And so they talk a lot about in the text about tilling your soil to help it dry out. And you might be thinking, dry out our soils? We live in the desert. Well, that is an issue, and the text is written from the perspective of more than half of the nation is trying to dry out their soils, trying to add aeration by not having as much moisture in the soil. I mean, think about Florida. They put in drain tiles to drain away the water so that they can grow crops. And so we have sort of a different situation here where it's not so much water related, but since we're doing irrigations most of the time, we can manage our soils in a way to not have them be waterlogged. We don't want to go from dry and parched to excessive. So that tillage can bring in lots of oxygen, but again, it can cause long-term compaction. So if I was to come in here with a tractor or a tiller, I could loosen up this soil, but the tines come down and they cut to a certain depth every single time. If you're not going in and deep ripping every once in a while, you build up what's called a plow pan, and it's a layer of compaction. Plus, think about the large equipment. When I go look at the neighboring farms and such, they're going out there, they're disking, they're planting, they're baling their hay, they're cutting, they're harvesting, they're putting fertilizer down. All that's requiring large equipment, and that's creating compaction, which is decreasing that pore space. And so I mentioned a few weeks ago when we were talking about watering, I was talking about potted plants. People make the mistake of, adding water onto gravel where there's this marked difference between you have this potting soil type mixture, which might be a mixture of peat and perlite, lots of organic material. It's mimicking the structure we would want. It's mimicking the texture that we would want in a soil. Mix like a loamy mix, but you do so with inert materials, sterile materials, and organic materials that will then hold the moisture. And so you take a potted plant, you put all that perfect soil in there to a certain level, and then below that you put a layer of rock or a layer of sand or something with much higher pore space, thinking the drainage is going to be better, and the water moves down to a certain point, and it gets to that layer, and everything above there becomes perched water table. And it's too much water. Below there, when it gets to a certain point, gravity will bring it down through and then it'll drain out. But you're just decreasing the root zone. So in the container industry, a lot of people are going to taller containers, container growing plants, taller containers, so that they know there's going to be a layer of no air being in there. It's like anaerobic soil, and no roots are going to be able to grow in there either. So My horticulture students will appreciate that. And also turf grass needs aeration. You see certain times of the year, certain fields, they'll go in and they have a machine that rolls through and it plugs. It takes these plugs out. They're like an inch or 2 inches deep. They're skinny and it's like a drum. It's pulling these plugs up, but then it pulls it to the soil surface, because what happens is you do that year after year. Aeration, that's a place for air to get in, it's a place for water to penetrate, it's a place for nutrients to get down in, and your soil is improved. The stuff that ends up on the top a few years later is going to get plugged again, and it's going to keep building up. But if it always plugs to 1 inch deep over a certain amount of time, at the bottom of that there is going to be some kind of compaction layer, so you just have to think about that. For a long time people used like spikes, or in golf situations they were encouraging people to wear the spiked shoes, to then they're not only golfing but they're aerating the field at the same time. In theory, the spike, as it goes down, it's going to make compaction on the sides of the hole and at the bottom of the hole, so the plugging is thought of being the best at this time. So the biggest way that you can improve your soil aeration is by adding organic material. And I would recommend using organic material whether you have a sandy soil or whether you have a clayey soil as far as texture goes, because organic material is going to loosen up those soils. It's going to improve water holding capability and keep your soils as organic and natural as possible. So all this soil started off with a good texture soil, but I've been amending by adding compost year after year, and these plants that are growing right now will be the compost for later that then will come back onto the soil to continue to improve them. So these soils are pretty good, and I've built that up over time. But we will be talking extensively about nutrients and composting in the coming weeks. So that's all I wanted to say to you about aeration. Thank you.